Good evening. Welcome to Washington. I'm Bret Baier. It was anything but regular order at the start of the 115th session of Congress. Today, the House majority scrapped plans to gut an independent ethics panel after President-elect Donald Trump sent out a couple of tweets aimed at his own party. The about-face by House Republicans came less than 24 hours after a closed-door meeting to adopt the measure. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel is on Capitol Hill tonight, where it was more than just pomp and circumstance today on the first day of the new Congress. Good evening, Mike.
Bret, good evening. The 115th Congress is up and running, but there was some drama after President-elect Trump criticized an early move by House Republicans. Last night, behind closed doors, Republican lawmakers voted to reform the outside Office of Congressional Ethics as it considered its rules for the new Congress. This morning, Republican Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy was forced to defend a move he opposed.
First of all, it doesn't get dissolved, so I'm not in favor of dissolving it. I was not in favor of moving forward in the rules package with it because I thought we should take it by itself in a bipartisan manner because there are people on both sides of the aisle that would support these reforms. The Ethics Committee will still be there.
But the real trouble came this morning when President-elect Trump flexed some muscle on Twitter. Quote, "With all that Congress has to work on, do they really have to make the weakening of the independent ethics watchdog, as unfair as it may be, their #1 act and priority? Focus on tax reform, health care, and so many other things of far greater importance. Hashtag drain the swamp." Shortly before gaveling in at noon, House Republicans reversed themselves, dropping plans for now on modifying the independent ethics panel.
Right.
The Office of Congressional Ethics investigated California Democrat Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who was ultimately cleared by the House Ethics Committee after a 3-year investigation and a $1 million legal bill for taxpayers. Some GOP members called it an unforced error in terms of timing, especially since Democrats have complaints about that outside group.
There are members who believe there are needed revisions. I'd say it's a bipartisan agreement. There need to be some changes. As I said last night, I voted against this particular amendment because of the oversight language that I thought was a bit ambiguous and needed further clarification.
Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi pounced, saying, quote, "Reversing their plans to destroy the Office of Congressional Ethics will not obscure their clear contempt for ethics in the people's House." Once again, the American people have seen the toxic dysfunction of a Republican House that will do anything to further their special interest agenda, thwart transparency, and undermine the public trust. There was no drama on the vote for House Speaker, with Paul Ryan being reelected as expected. And he told members this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
The people have given us unified government. And it wasn't because they were feeling generous. It was because they want results.
In terms of delivering results, Republicans are getting started on repealing Obamacare in a hurry. Vice President-elect Mike Pence is due up here tomorrow. At the same time, President Obama will be meeting with Democrats about trying to save it. Bret?
Mike Emanuel live on Capitol Hill. Mike, thank you. The president-elect spent the day in New York putting the finishing touches on his cabinet and once again calling out big business with 140 characters. Correspondent Peter Ducey reports from New York tonight on Trump's latest moves.
The president-elect showed again today he has no problem making an example out of an American company he thinks is trying to make money here off products made elsewhere. At Real Donald Trump tweeted, quote, "General Motors is sending Mexican-made model of Chevy Cruze to U.S. car dealers tax-free across border. Make in USA or pay big border tax." Tweets like that have moved markets in the past. Just ask Boeing and Lockheed Martin, who eventually adjusted cost estimates for major projects under pressure by the president-elect. So GM quickly responded like this, quote, "General Motors manufactures the Chevrolet Cruze sedan in Lordstown, Ohio. All Chevrolet Cruze sedans sold in the U.S. are built in GM's assembly plant in Lordstown, Ohio. GM builds the Chevrolet Cruze hatchback for global markets in Mexico, with a small number sold in the U.S. But GM didn't mention there the Lordstown, Ohio plant they are touting as a defense is about to lose about 1,000 jobs. Because gas is cheap, people aren't clamoring for fuel-efficient cars. And while one American car company was being criticized by the next commander-in-chief, another was being praised. Ford announced it's not going forward with the new plant in Mexico and has instead chosen to invest $700 million in a Michigan facility, something candidate Trump said he was hoping would happen.
You look at what Ford is doing. They're building billions of dollars worth of plants in Mexico. I want them to build the plants in the United States.
Today's move saved about 700 jobs in the States, and the company's CEO says this was a business-first decision, but he admits executives in the boardroom at Ford HQ have been paying attention to what Mr. Trump has said on the trail.
When we look at some of the tax and regulatory reforms that he's been talking about, that gives us a lot of confidence, and this is a vote of confidence that he can deliver on those things.
The promise of better trade deals helped Trump gain steam during the primaries, and he's announced he wants Reagan administration veteran Robert Lighthizer to be U.S. trade rep, a cabinet-level job in an administration led by someone attempting to stimulate economic growth in a way no president ever has before.
I have never seen a president in the modern era go after specific companies like Donald Trump has and really trying to embarrass them into getting some changes, which he has been able to do. So I think this is without precedent.
And news is breaking tonight that someone Mr. Trump has fired before on The Apprentice may soon be hired for a job at his White House. Omarosa Manigault is being considered for a position in the Trump administration. She was one of his earliest and most enthusiastic celebrity endorsers. Bret?
Peter Ducey outside Trump Tower. Peter, thank you. U.S. manufacturing activity hit a two-year high in December, showing a positive sign for economic growth. The Institute for Supply Management said its manufacturing index came in at 54.7 last month, the highest reading since the end of 2014. Any reading over 50 signals growth. The markets ended the day in the green today. The Dow was up 119, just shy of that elusive 20,000 mark. The S&P 500 rose 19. The Nasdaq finished ahead 46. So will the Dow hit the 20,000 mark this week? Liz Clayman, host of Fox Business Network's Countdown to the Closing Bell, joins me now with a look at the numbers. Good evening, Liz. What did today's tone with that market set?
Well, it kind of gave us a scare, actually. At one point, Bret, we were up 176 points. Then we lost nearly all of the gains. And then, as you saw, we ended with a pretty sizable move to the upside of about 119 points. But in between, a lot of people were saying, wait a minute. As January goes, so goes the rest of the year. That is an old saying that I want your viewers to forget. Why? Because it used to be that you could divine how the entire stock market would perform over the entire year simply by looking at the first 5 days of January. Last year completely blew that theory to smithereens because January endured a jaw-dropping 5.5% loss. And then what did we see? Had you sold on that, thinking that that would sort of color the rest of the year, you would have missed out on major gains. The Dow ended up adding about 13%. And even the small and mid cap saw a 20% gain, which was just a great performance for all of 2016. So you don't want to do that and look at those market voodoo numbers. What do you want to do? You really have to look at the moment with all we've got, and that is some serious optimism coming from a Trump presidency. It's just about 17 days away from the inauguration. Already we've seen incredible returns for the markets on the belief that Donald Trump will be very business positive simply by cutting taxes. He will slice like regulations. This is what he said he will do. And, of course, instituting a pretty big infrastructure spending plan. All of those things together give people optimism, and it does tend to have a pretty decent velocity effect. So perhaps that's what we go on at the moment. And sure enough, when you look at something like the Wilshire 5000, which is sort of a bigger index than the S&P 500, since Donald Trump was elected, so the day after, November 9th, it added $1.7 trillion to that index. So, you go with that, looks pretty good.
Yeah, and quickly, Liz, you look at the pro-growth focus that the markets are looking at with the Trump administration, and yet he might not be great for all stocks. We just heard from Peter's report. He took on General Motors. He's hit other companies before for moving jobs offshore. What does this say about the power of the president-elect's tweets and their effects on the market?
Major power, and you saw it today as Peter articulated. You know, he took on General Motors. He wants any cars that are made south of the border that are coming back into the U.S. from American companies. He says, too bad, folks. You don't get a free ride there. You've got to pay a border tax. Initially, General Motors started to fall, and then it managed to eke out just under 1% gain. But we have seen other stocks, like United Technologies, the parent of Carrier, before it sort of found the Trump religion and promised to bring these jobs back to the U.S., you saw those stocks start to falter. There is huge power in what Donald Trump is able to do. When he takes on those companies, you can bet other companies are kind of ducking and covering. Ford, of course, said, don't worry, we're not going to open that plant in Mexico. But there are many, many companies, Bret, that have operations elsewhere that are based in the U.S., and can you take on each one? It's going to be very hard.
Well, they're all definitely following real Donald Trump. We can guarantee that. Liz, thank you. Another forceful response today from the controversial head of WikiLeaks, who says the Obama administration is connecting dots where there aren't any. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge reports tonight on a new round of finger-pointing in the hacks of political figures around the election being blamed on the Russian government.
In an exclusive interview, the head of WikiLeaks told Fox's Sean Hannity that the Russian government was not his source for the DNC and Clinton campaign emails.
Can you tell the American people 1,000% you did not get it from Russia or anybody associated with Russia?
We can say, we have said repeatedly over the last 2 months that our source is not the Russian government. And it is not a state party.
Assange, who sought refuge in London's Ecuadorian embassy 4 years ago to avoid extradition on sexual assault allegations, said President Obama is not being straight with the American people.
He's acting like a lawyer. If you look at most of his statements, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say WikiLeaks obtained its information from Russia, worked with Russia.
On this recent analysis released by the Bureau and Homeland Security, or DHS, blaming the Russian civilian and military intelligence services, Assange said the public evidence is weak.
What was missing from all of those statements? The word WikiLeaks. That's very strange.
I'm still waiting to be briefed by the FBI and DHS.
While the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee wants more information on the Russian government connection, he has no doubts about Moscow's aggressive activity in cyberspace. Last week, Homeland Security declassified this map showing infrastructure like the power grid in 60 countries has been co-opted by Moscow's intelligence services.
We suspect that Russia might potentially have malware in different systems.
On Friday, the Washington Post reported that a Vermont power grid was breached by Russian hackers. But over the weekend, the story was corrected. A laptop that was not attached to the grid contained malicious code linked to the Russian operation. In a recent telephone interview from his Romanian jail cell, the hacker who first exposed Hillary Clinton's use of a private email for government business said the allegations are overblown because of Cold War sensitivities.
Americans are crazy about the Russians. I mean, like, okay, now the Russians are invading the United States. It's crazy. I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's this hysteria, you know.
CIA Director John Brennan tonight cast doubt on the claims made by Julian Assange, telling PBS that the report requested by the president will explain exactly what happened. That intelligence report could be ready as early as this week, and based on our reporting, there's a real desire to make parts of the report public to answer lingering questions and to silence critics. Bret.
Okay, Catherine, thank you. The White House continues to stand by the intelligence community in blaming Russia over the election-related hacks and the punishment the administration doled out. But critics wonder what made the Obama administration finally move on sanctions when it barely reacted to a hack on more than 20 million government employees that was linked directly to China. Correspondent Kevin Cork has some answers tonight from the White House.
Materially different. That's how White House officials described allegations of hacking conducted by the Chinese and Russian governments, a distinction that guided the Obama administration's very public rebuke of Russia for its alleged meddling in the run-up to the 2016 election and its almost muted response to the Chinese OPM hack that compromised the private information of tens of millions of Americans.
I'm not suggesting that somehow that's not important. What I'm just saying is that it's materially different than the kind of hack and leak strategy that we saw the Russians engage in to try to influence our democracy.
To suggest the U.S. responses were in stark contrast would be an understatement. This time the administration expelled operatives, shut down facilities, issued a report to Congress, and made direct contact with Vladimir Putin.
What we can also do is to on a bilateral basis, warn other countries against these kinds of attacks. And we've done that in the past.
Indeed, experts suggest the U.S. strategy for China was a years-long series of diplomatic and legal efforts, a far cry from the decision to publicly humiliate Moscow.
There's issues of legacy, there's optics that are critically important to be able to back up their assertions about the Russian cyber operations against American political entities.
And while there have been conflicting reports about Russia's involvement in the hacks, analysts believe the White House had little choice but to make an example out of the Kremlin.
The notion that you have to wait for absolute proof about something before you act is a bad formula to use in international relations. You never have absolute proof, and if you're simply waiting for more information, more intelligence, you're letting events dictate your policy rather than you dictating it.
Bret, senior administration officials say the crux of their argument is simply this. While the Chinese stole for intelligence gathering, the Russians tried to weaponize the use of that data to influence the U.S. election. And they quickly add that the U.S. response, Bret, is not over yet. Bret?
Kevin Cork live on the North Lawn. Kevin, thank you. The false reporting by the Washington Post mentioned in Catherine Herridge's story over the possibility that Russia hacked into our electrical grid raises questions about the media's quest for more examples of Russia hacking. That dealt with Vermont. Fox News media analyst and host of Fox's Media Buzz, Howard Kurtz, is here with whether the story was founded or whether really a case of media hysteria on this issue. Good evening, Howard.
Good evening, Brad.
How did it all come to pass?
Well, the Washington Post ran a dramatic headline last Friday. Russian hackers penetrated U.S. electricity grid through a utility in Vermont, U.S. officials say. The paper said the discovery of a computer code associated with Russian hackers at this utility reflected a potentially serious vulnerability for America's electric grid. Democratic Senator Pat Leahy called it a direct threat to Vermont, but the story quickly began short-circuiting.
Did the Post acknowledge problems with the story?
Slowly. 90 minutes after the piece was posted online, the utility said, as we just heard, only a single line of so-called malware was found at one laptop not connected to the Burlington grid. The Post, which should have waited for the utility's response, softened its headline to say there was only a risk to the grid. The next day, Bret, the newspaper, acknowledged in an editor's note that the original story incorrectly said that Russian hackers had penetrated the U.S. electric grid, which brings us to the Washington Post story today that essentially amounts to a complete retraction.
Yeah, so how much of the original story was rolled back?
Here is the headline. Russian government hackers do not appear to have targeted Vermont utility, say people close to the investigation. In fact, the paper said that line of suspicious code may even have been benign. In other words, every key element of the first story was wrong. And some media outlets have pounced on the Post, with Forbes magazine calling the story fake news. A spokeswoman told me today the paper has no comment.
Okay, Howie, thank you. Donald Trump's former presidential rival will be in attendance at his inauguration later this month. Aides to Hillary and Bill Clinton confirmed the couple will be there on January 20th. Also attending will be former President George W. Bush and former First Lady Laura Bush. Former President Jimmy Carter will be there too, but we're told former President George H.W. Bush will not attend due to health reasons. Up next, the fight for Utah land, the steep climb facing critics of what they say was a land grab by the Obama administration. We'll explain. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 13 in Salt Lake City, where a security camera captures a 2-year-old boy rescuing his twin brother after a dresser fell over on the toddler. The twins' parents say they were upstairs when the incident happened and did not discover that one of the boys had been trapped until reviewing the camera footage. Despite their son being okay, the parents say they have posted the video online to remind others of the dangers of not securing furniture to the wall. Fox 6 in Birmingham, Alabama, where a possible tornado caused 4 out of 5 weather-related deaths in the southeast. Severe storms swept across Alabama, Georgia, and into the Florida Panhandle, where a man died in flooding. And this is a live look from our affiliate in Atlanta. Fox 5, the big story there tonight, a state legislature's plan to ban adults from smoking in the car when children are present. State Representative Sandra Scott has pre-filed legislation for the ban that could be taken up as early as next week. Representative Scott says she knows such a law would be difficult to enforce, but said the goal is about education. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway. Utah's Attorney General is promising a fight over land designated a national monument last week by President Obama. The AG there says a lawsuit is already in the works over the 1.3 million acres in the southeastern part of the state. National correspondent William Lajeunesse reports tonight on the controversy over Baier's Ears.
This canyon is a little ruin site.
Indian ruins and one-of-a-kind rock art. Just two reasons why President Obama recently set aside more than 1 million acres in Utah as the Baier's Ears National Monument, a designation already under attack.
They ignored us. They continue to ignore us.
Hundreds of Utah residents recently rallied against the monument, calling it a land grab to satisfy the president's environmental allies while restricting access, grazing, and development.
We'll have a comment when we actually file the lawsuit.
So you are going to file one, though?
We're planning on filing a lawsuit.
But Utah's new Attorney General faces a daunting challenge. The courts have never reduced the president's authority under the Antiquities Act.
I think, to be fair, the case would have to go to the Supreme Court of the United States.
Previous attempts to unwind national monument declarations have failed, including lawsuits challenging President Clinton's designation of 1.7 million acres in Utah in 1996. Baier's Ears is smaller, but contains unique artifacts.
He's just in a class all of his own if you compare it to other rock art around here.
Critics admit these Indian petroglyphs deserve protection, but feel the area being protected goes beyond the scope of the law.
Just hope Trump can do something. Repeal this thing.
The new Utah claim is unusual. It comes with the governor's support and a new president not beholden to tradition.
I think we're in a new day, and if the Attorney General of Utah sues or the Nevada Attorney General sues, I think they're going to get a different response from the President of the United States and Attorney General Sessions.
The proclamation does remove the land from oil and gas development, but opponents argue that any monument should require congressional approval, as well as the state where it is located. Bret?
William, thank you. The president-elect's challenge to Chicago's Democratic Mayor, Rahm Emanuel, to ask for help put another spotlight on that city plagued with violence. The new year got off to a violent start with more than 40 people shot over the holiday weekend. Tonight, correspondent Matt Finn reports from Chicago on the problems facing the city's police department.
President-elect Donald Trump is taking on Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel over the city's record-setting violence. Trump tweeting, Chicago murder rate is record-setting, 4,331 shooting victims with 762 murders in 2016. If mayor can't do it, he must ask for federal help. This just weeks after the liberal Democratic Mayor Emanuel met with the president-elect at Trump Tower. Emanuel's spokesperson replying to Trump's tweet saying in part, quote, as the president-elect knows from his conversation with the mayor, we agree the federal government has a strong role to play in public safety. In 2016, more people were killed in Chicago than New York and L.A. combined, the highest figures in 2 decades.
This is a Chicago problem.
Father Michael Pfleger has led Chicago's African-American community in its fight back against crime.
If we're going to continue to Band-Aid, we're going to continue to see carnage in our streets.
Pfleger says he reached out to Trump during the 2016 campaign but didn't hear back. He agrees that Chicago needs federal funding.
When there's a fire in America, when there's a hurricane, when there's a tornado in America, they call it a state of emergency. Federal funds come in and help rebuild that town, rebuild that community. Well, hell, we have a state of emergency in Chicago.
In the crowd at Pfleger's march, his ally, civil rights leader Reverend Jesse Jackson, calling for a White House conference on violence. Chicago's crime problem is complex. Illegal guns, gang battles over turf and cheap narcotics, the city's exclusive agreement with the ACLU that ended stop and frisks, and low police morale among accusations of racism and brutality. The city's top cop says it's time to get tough.
If you do pick up a gun and you use it, you'll be held accountable. And right now, we don't do that.
Heavily criticized Mayor Rahm Emanuel recently cleared the funding to add 1,000 new officers to the streets of Chicago. CPD is under investigation by the Department of Justice for misconduct, and the entire city awaits its ruling. Bret?
Matt Finn in Chicago. Matt, thank you. President-elect Donald Trump has called the United Nations a waste of time and money and nothing more than a club for people to hang out. Today, the UN's new Secretary General says he isn't concerned about the president-elect's remarks Antonio Guterres said today he is focused on getting countries to come together to solve the problems the world is facing, including terrorism, human rights violations, poverty, and inequality. One of the many challenges the president-elect will confront as soon as he is sworn in on January 20th, and by many accounts the most dangerous, is North Korea's accelerating drive towards a nuclear weapon and nuclear weapons capability on top of an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile. Yet, as Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen reports from the State Department, the president-elect is hardly waiting until January 20th to let Pyongyang know where he stands on this issue.
In his New Year's Day address on state-run TV, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un delivered the usual broadsides at America.
We should terminate meddling of the United States and other foreign powers who aim for an Asian-Pacific invasion by controlling South Korea.
More worrisome to U.S. officials, however, was Kim's claim to have reached the final stages of testing for an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. If true, it would mean the Stalinist regime in Pyongyang, which conducted 2 underground nuclear tests last year, would soon be able to strike the mainland U.S. with a rocket capable of carrying a miniaturized nuclear warhead.
I believe North Korea could fire a missile that could hit the United States today, and I mean at least the west coast of the United States, with a rocket that qualifies as an ICBM. However, North Korea probably has not perfected the technology for a re-entry vehicle for the warhead and the technology for a guidance system.
At the State Department, officials declined to say whether Kim was bluffing about long-range missiles, but did assess his progress on warheads.
We do not believe that he, at this point in time, has the capability to tip one of these with a nuclear warhead.
At the Pentagon, officials acknowledged that America's own missile defense systems designed to shoot down an ICBM carrying a nuclear weapon last tested successfully in 2014.
Given all the aspects of our broader missile defense system, our layered system, we feel confident in our ability to deter this threat and protect American citizens.
President-elect Trump greeted Kim's claims with one of his laser-focused tweets. Writing Monday, North Korea just stated that it is in the final stages of developing a nuclear weapon capable of reaching parts of the U.S. It won't happen, unquote. And Mr. Trump followed up that tweet with another in which he criticized China for refusing to rein in the nuclear ambitions of its client state in Pyongyang. The Chinese Foreign Ministry today denied doing nothing on the North Korean account and called on all sides to avoid aggravating the issue. Bret?
James Rosen live at the State Department. James, thank you. There's frightening new video tonight showing the face of the suspected killer of 39 people at a Turkish nightclub over the new year. At least 14 people have been detained so far in connection with that attack, but the killer remains at large. Correspondent John Huddy reports on the hunt for an assassin.
In a 44-second recording, what appears to be a selfie video, the suspected gunman responsible for the New Year's Day massacre in Turkey is seen circling Taksim Square in Istanbul with a menacing look. Turkish police have not confirmed the authenticity of the video. It was run by Turkey state television and other media outlets. But tonight, we're learning more details about the attack and the ongoing investigation. Police reportedly know who the killer is, having used his fingerprints, pictures, and video to ID him, including this surveillance video from the entrance of the nightclub where the New Year's party turned into a nightmare. 3, 2, 1. The cheers and celebration became screams and cries for help early Sunday morning when the killer stormed the nightclub and, according to Turkish police, unloaded 180 rounds into the crowd. ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack, calling the gunman a soldier of the caliphate. Turkish officials describe him as a highly professional assassin. His name is still unknown. Today, hundreds of people marched outside the nightclub, condemning the violence, and like this man, saying they will not surrender to ISIS. Of the 39 people killed, 27 were foreign nationals.
We are very sad about the 27 foreign nationals who, despite the warnings of their governments, believed Turkey was a safe place.
And tonight, Turkey's train and bus stations, the airports, also the border crossings remain on high alert. The hope is that this New Year's Day killer is still in Turkey and has not already slipped across the border into Syria. Bret?
John Huddy in our Middle East newsroom. John, thank you. More detainees will be transferred from the detention center at Guantanamo Bay. The White House said today to expect additional transfers to be announced before President Obama leaves office. The news comes on the heels of a tweet from President-elect Trump this morning in which he wrote, quote, "There should be no further releases from Gitmo. These are extremely dangerous people and should not be allowed back onto the battlefield." Defense officials tell Fox News they expect a transfer of nearly 20 more detainees before Inauguration Day. Customs and Border Patrol officials say all systems are back up and running after a 4-hour outage at airports Monday across the country. Travelers waited in long lines after a problem with the processing system for international passengers Monday. Customs and Border Patrol say there's an initial investigation is showing that a problem with the changes to software used to process travelers, and now that issue has been resolved. During that outage, border agents processed travelers using alternative procedures until the system came back online. President-elect Donald Trump gets Congress to change its course of action even before he gets into the Oval Office. We'll explain, and the all-star panel weighs in on the power play next.
So I want to say to the American people, we hear you. We will do right by you, and we will deliver. To the minority, I want to say this. We've never shied away from our disagreements, and I do not expect anyone to do so now. But however bright of a contrast that we draw between us, it must never blind us to the common ground that we share.
House Democrats pledge to seek common ground wherever we can, to forge a bipartisan path forward on job-creating infrastructure, to make taxes and foreign trade fair to American workers.
Well, with that, the 115th Congress went into session, but not before some drama. Today, you had a situation where the House Republicans reversed themselves. Last night, they went into closed session, and they decided to abandon this ethics, independent ethics group outside of the Congressional Ethics Committee, the Office of Congressional Ethics. Then Donald Trump on Twitter said this: with all that Congress has to work on, do they really have to make the weakening of the independent ethics watchdog, as unfair as it is, may be, their #1 act and priority? Focus on tax reform, health care, and so many other things of far greater importance. From the President-elect's Twitter feed, then the House Republicans abandoned it. Not everybody was happy about it, though.
This decision that was made by the House conference last night was an objective decision made upon the activities of the OCE that unjustly target members of Congress, and they should not be subjected to anonymous complaints that are acted upon by a body that then leaks that information out to the public, and they have to defend themselves in the public. That's unjust. I think we should have gone forward, and I'm going to push for the full disbandment and abolishment of the OCE.
So it was a rocky start. Let's bring in our panel. Editor-in-Chief of LifeZette, Laura Ingram. Charles Lane, opinion writer for The Washington Post, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Okay, Laura, what about this rollout, you know, the abolishment of this office, and what the image looked like?
It was disastrous timing and messaging. For the first moment out the gate, they had this story out there. When I woke up and I saw this morning, I thought to myself, you've got to be kidding me. Donald Trump just won this startling victory based on draining the swamp. And once again, I think the substance on this aside, which I think Steve King has a point about the anonymous complaints and so forth, but just on the storytelling aspect of this, the story you're telling to the American people after Donald Trump wins this upset victory is that we're going to change the ethics office so that it's fairer to Congress. Now, he was absolutely right to come out as he did. I had Marsha Blackburn on my radio show at 10:30 this morning, she had a hard time defending it on timing and messaging. She agreed that the Republicans bungle these things time and again. Trump reads the pulse of the people, again, better than the rank-and-file Republican on Capitol Hill. And Paul Ryan actually voted against this, we understand, but he wasn't able to turn enough votes
the leadership,
on his side.
Both Paul Ryan and Kevin McCarthy, others were against it. But here's Bob Goodlatte, Chuck, who was the chairman of the committee, Judiciary. The House must have a rules package under which to operate and serve our constituents. And ultimately, accepting the amendment from Majority Leader McCarthy was the only way to ensure the passage. That means making it go away. While I understand the need to do so, I am wholly disappointed that these important reforms to strengthen due process rights and the mission of the OCE did not move forward. Gross misrepresentation by opponents of my amendment and the media willing to go along with this agenda resulted in a flurry of misconceptions and unfounded claims about the true purpose of this amendment. He's trying to get into the weeds of defending this, but the bottom line, Chuck, is that the president-elect's Twitter account changed this outcome.
He seems to change quite a few things with tweets. I think there's a plant in Indiana that's going to have more people working at it because of some tweets. This is a really interesting unforced error because the history of this office goes back to the last time the Democrats took over the Congress back when George W. Bush was still president, and Nancy Pelosi had the slogan, "Drain the Swamp." And in pursuit of the Drain the Swamp movement by the Democrats, they put in this office. As it developed, quite a few Democrats ran afoul of this. Mel Watt was heard to give some of the very same kinds of complaints you just heard Steve King doing.
And let me just interrupt you. There was bipartisan opposition to this.
Precisely my point. Mel Watt's a Democrat. And my point being that I don't understand how the Republicans couldn't find a way to maybe wait a little while and work with the Democrats on something in common, because there are quite a few Democrats who privately agree with what they've done, even while they're publicly making a lot of hay out of it right now.
Meantime, on the Senate side, the top Democrat there, Chuck Schumer, took to the floor for his first speech, talking about the president-elect's communication.
These issues are too important for mere words. Our challenges too entrenched for mere tweeting. Making America great again requires more than 140 characters per issue. With all due respect, America cannot afford a Twitter presidency.
Charles.
Sore loser. The tweets are working. I mean, if they weren't, they wouldn't be using them. As Chuck indicated, Trump has used it on North Korea. He's used it on the Ford, General Motors, on this issue in which he won within hours. And it works. It has a lot of effect, and he's not even in office. I think when he's in office, it'll be a little more problematic because people will be presuming policy out of this, and it's hard to be either detailed or specific enough in a tweet to actually make coherent policy. So
nuance is tough in 140 characters.
Yeah, and well, right now, what Trump is doing is wielding a 2x4. And he certainly had to do it in the case of the House, because these guys are mules. That was about the dumbest first step you could ever make, particularly because, as we just heard, this is an issue on which Democrats agree there are real problems with this office they wanted to abolish. The idea of a sort of procedure, giving people a chance to defend themselves openly, is really quite weak in this. It should be reformed. But you don't do it in the middle of the night. You don't do it as a first act, and you don't do it without Democratic support. Just plain stupid.
All right, Laura, I want to get to those tweets on GM. Today, the president-elect, General Motors is sending Mexican-made model of Chevy Cruze to U.S. car dealers tax-free across border, make in USA or pay big border tax. GM released a statement about that tweet saying General Motors manufactures the Chevy Cruze sedan in Lordstown, Ohio. All Chevy Cruze sedans sold in the U.S. are built in GM's assembly plant in Lordstown, Ohio. GM builds the Chevy Cruze hatchback for global markets in Mexico, with a small number sold in the U.S. So, I mean, the last line essentially confirms that some of those cars are made in Mexico. What about this specific company kind of going after specific issues on Twitter?
I think ultimately the better policy will be corporate tax reform, real regulatory reform that makes the environment here in the United States a lot more hospitable to innovation, job creation, for businesses to stay here. But right now he's in this interesting period, 17 days before inauguration. He already has, at least symbolically, some of these wins on the board. And PR-wise, I think they're really good for what he wants to do with a more populist approach to Republican policy. And also for these companies, they're feeling huge pressure from the public at large. I mean, you go on message boards, you go on Facebook, they were getting hammered on the Carrier air conditioning, and the car company. But the CEO today in various interviews said they're doing what's best for their company. It wasn't, I think he was trying to distance the Trump tweets as having much of an influence.
Yeah, well, Ford watches the tweets too, and they made an announcement on their own. You know, you saw Lockheed, you saw Boeing take a hit in stocks after these tweets. Chuck, last word on this.
It astonishes me that people are taking it in stride that a future president of the United States is going around threatening free enterprises with punishment for doing what is in their best interests and in the interests of their stockholders. The only thing more shocking is the spinelessness of the companies who knuckle under it.
It really can't go on. You can't really, in an economy with hundreds of millions, tens of millions of workers, you're getting these small gains here and there. It obviously is working and portraying the image of Trump as a guy who delivers on promises, who wants to protect the working people. But in the end, you can't govern this way. These are small pebbles in the pond, and it's got to be larger policy. It works as president-elect. I don't think it's something he can do as president.
We will see. Next up, more on the president-elect's tweets. This time, a look at how foreign nations are reacting, and specifically North Korea, and how dangerous that is.
The reason we have more than 28,000 troops in South Korea right now, ready to fight tonight. This is a country that's clearly shown a willingness to threaten the United States, threaten our allies in the region, and we're going to continue to do everything we need to protect ourselves from that threat.
He's putting North Korea on notice through this tweet and through other statements that this won't happen. He, as President of the United States, wants to stand between them and their missile capabilities, which experts say could be deployed to reach Seattle almost immediately.
Okay, they're talking about more tweets, this time on foreign policy. The president-elect saying North Korea just stated that it is in the final stages of developing a nuclear weapon capable of reaching parts of the U.S. It won't happen. Continuing, China has been taking up massive amounts of money and wealth from the U.S. in totally one-sided trade, but won't help with North Korea. Nice. Let's be clear. At the end of that last panel, Laura, Charles was saying that it might not work policy-wise long-term, but it is working now as far as moving a needle as the president-elect.
Well, here's the stark reality, is this is going to be, I believe, his first major challenge as commander-in-chief. North Korea doesn't get the attention it deserves as a major geopolitical struggle for the United States. And since 1953, we've had an armistice with North Korea. The war never really ended. We just had an armistice in place. That's why we have all the troops there. China doesn't want that regime to collapse. If it does, there'll be a massive spillover into China. So they really haven't done much of anything to help. They don't want the Cabbage Patch Doll president of North Korea. Sorry, but that's what he looks like. They don't want him to. They don't want him to go nuclear. But they also don't want the regime to, disintegrate. So what does Trump do? Do we want a preemptive war, preemptive strike against the ICBM sites in North Korea? Obama tried we want six-party talks. That never happened.
Well, Bush tried it too.
Everybody's, Madeleine Albright was clinking champagne glasses with Kim Jong-il. And none of it worked. And now we're on the brink of, perhaps in the next 2 to 3 years, they're having nuclear capability. It's not an easy situation, but again, it's not going to be handled necessarily by a tweet.
Here's what the White House said today. Josh Earnest on North Korea.
The intelligence community has previously said that the United States has not seen North Korea test or demonstrate the ability to miniaturize a nuclear weapon and put it on an ICBM. I'm not aware that assessment has changed. Some of the administration, the intelligence community officials that I'd spoken to today were not aware that assessment has changed. If it has changed, it's something that will come from the intelligence community. With regard to the president-elect's tweets, I'll let his team explain it.
So, Chuck, you know, so far they're not seeing it develop yet, but it seems like they're heading that way. They've had a lot of tests and failures, North Korea has, and they do rattle the saber a lot to try to get deals on food.
The key question, I guess strategically and militarily, is precisely whether or not they can actually load a working nuclear device onto the ICBM. That's the threshold they haven't gotten past yet. And we have time in that sense. But the question is, can we find out that they have that capability before they actually test it and before it's actually kind of out there and ready to go? That's
historically, the intel out of North Korea is really bad.
Very tough. And I couldn't really improve on the summary Laura gave you of exactly how difficult this choice is going to be. It's worth remembering that at the very beginning of Bill Clinton's administration, they came about that close, the Clinton administration, to getting into a preemptive war with North Korea based on what they perceived the progress to have been at that time, which led to the 20-plus years of failed negotiations we've had since. If it did come to a conflict with North Korea over this, you couldn't say that the United States hasn't given diplomacy a chance, because it's been tried and hasn't worked for over 20 years.
And both parties' administrations running the White House. Charles, if you look around the world, Syria, Iran, what's happening all over the Middle East, do you see North Korea as the biggest threat?
It is, because it's a threat to the actual existence of San Francisco. You know, Syria is an issue, but it's not a threat to the lives of 1 million Americans. And this is a regime that's completely unpredictable. And remember, our ability to predict nuclear stuff, going all the way back to the end of the Second World War, is terrible. We did not predict the Russians in '49, the Chinese in '64, India or Pakistan. We had no idea. We were caught by surprise. Look, there are only 3 options. One is a preemptive strike on the missile launchers, which will inevitably, immediately precipitate a land war. They're going to invade South Korea. The other is to shoot down the missile using our defensive systems, which we probably can do, although who knows. The Democrats have a tendency to go easy on testing the defensive missiles. The third is not what Trump thinks, which is economic pressure. It's not going to work on the Chinese. We have tried that regarding North Korea. There's one thing I believe that will deter them. We announced that we look favorably on Japan and South Korea acquiring defensive nukes. That will scare the hell out of the Chinese, and it might move them to do something.
Quickly, Laura, China is the key.
It always has been, I think, and Charles is right to throw out that other option. Trump's he's unpredictable on this. That's good. I mean, the old, do it the sanctions way, that hasn't worked. The unpredictability might be actually in his favor in this regard.
That is it for the panel. Next up, a little fun from today's swearing in.